The Art of Being Ruled. Wyndham Lewis. Original publication 1926. 1989 edition. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Part 8. The Vicious Circle. Chapter 7. Samuel Butler's Love, and the Romance of Destruction of the Man of Science. Before closing this section of my argument, I will make a few more general observations which may help to clarify it further. Samuel Butler, in his notebooks, describes all human love as eating and swallowing. Here are his words: "Who would kiss an oyster? Loving and hating. I have often said that there is no true love short of eating and consequent assimilation. The embryonic processes are but one long course of eating and assimilation. The sperm and germ cells, or the two elements that go to form the new animal, whatever they should be called, eat one another up, and then the mother assimilates them, more or less, through mutual interfeeding and interbreeding between her and them. We think we dote upon our horses and dogs, but we do not really love them, because we do not eat them. What, on the other hand, can awaken less consciousness of warm affection than an oyster? Who would press an oyster to his heart, or pat it and want to kiss it? Yet nothing short of its complete absorption into our own being can in the least satisfy us. No merely superficial, temporary contact of exterior form to exterior form will serve us. The embrace must be consummate, not achieved by a mocking environment of draped and muffled arms that leaves no lasting trace on organization or consciousness, but by an enfolding within the bare and warm bosom of an open mouth, a grinding out of all differences of opinion by the sweet persuasion of the jaws, and the eloquence of a tongue that now convinces all the more powerfully because it is inarticulate and deals but with one universal language of agglutination. Then we become made one with what we love, not heart to heart, but protoplasm to protoplasm, and this is far more to the purpose. This is the Darwinian nightmare of the struggle for existence, operating on a sensitive mind, converted into a spectacular paradox. I could eat you. One lover says to another at the paroxysm of their lubricity. And indeed, if one were considerably smaller than the other, as in the case of the male of the Epeira, that no doubt would happen very often. But if the supreme caress is to swallow the person you love, either at a mouthful or in pieces, then it seems reasonable to say that there is little difference between sexual love and swallowing a half-dozen oysters. All men kill the thing they love, Oscar Wilde says, in his reading jail. All men eat the thing they love, Butler says in his notebooks. In the above quotation, our affection for a dog is contrasted with our lack of affection for an oyster. Yet we do not love dogs, or we would eat them, it says. I believe a definition of beauty is to be found by following out the dog and oyster parallel. It is only when something is independent of us, a non-assimilable universe of its own, that we love it, as we call it. Most men dislike the look of an oyster, as they dislike the appearance of the underneath of their tongue. Love is the pearl of the oyster in Sappho, not the oyster, but they find it lovely to eat. Two creatures of opposite sex love each other, they do not eat each other usually, or come together in that way. As Butler says, they pet and kiss each other. There is a superficial temporary contact of exterior form only. It is in the creation of a third, and again separate, being that they mingle completely. This act of creation, of a something more, is an act of love. The eating of the oyster is an act of destruction, however it may, indirectly, make tissue. The superficial contact of exterior form which characterizes the love of the more complex animals is essential to the existence of love or affection, that is an emotion for something different to the self, that cannot be absorbed into the self, in the sense of be eaten. That detachment, distance, and, as it were, chastity, and intense personal sensation on our side, is at the bottom of all our spiritual values, as we name what about us is independent of feeding and renewing our machine. Butler's sentiments for the oyster would literally have to become platonic, on the principle of Gilbert's affection à la Plato, for a bashful young potato, or a not too French bean, for him to be justified in giving the same name to it as to what he would feel for Mary or Kate. The platonic condition, always in the Gilbertian sense, is essential, then, also to the existence of beauty. The ideas of beauty, of a god, or of love, depend severally on separation and differentiation. The savage ate his god to procure divinity for himself, so showing his foolishness, for his act was like attempting to devour the beauty of a mountain or a river, or to convert his love for another person into the tissue of his own body, or like buying or selling a dream. Freud's obsession of incest is in the same order of things. Bergson has a lot of one side of Butler in him. Perhaps he consumed a good deal of him at one time of his life. His creative evolution, like Nietzsche's will to power and glorification of carnage and the sentiment aroused by acts of destruction, is of course, like Butler, under the shadow of Darwin. Mr. Shaw's version of creative evolution, cf. Methuselah, preface, relates Bergson and Butler further. I have devoted so much space to this definition of love because it has a great deal of bearing on what presently I shall have to say on the subject of Bergssonism. Bergson's doctrinaire immersion in the waves of the vital flux is the same thing, only, in that case it would be the love of the eater as he englobed what was plunged into him, the love of the bloodstream for the juices that reach it. Returning again to Butler's amusing note, in the ordinary way we take these desperate statements with a grain of appropriate salt, as a philosopher's jest or a poet's madness. We know that all the married couples in a London suburb do not, in fact, eat each other, except figuratively. Nor do they make meals off their children, nor vice versa. At such extravagances we consider we can afford to smile with civilized superiority, yet we register the truth they symbolically contain. As we have erected, developed, and organized ourselves in a variety of ways, become human, and deliberately and by a great effort of consciousness marked ourselves off from animals, when we say we are humane we mean precisely that we do not destroy and subsequently eat one another, or eat one another alive, then it is certain that biology or science generally is not helping us in our ambitious make-believe by referring us back gleefully to the oyster, the male of the Epeira, the ichneumon fly, etc. Science, or the man of science, of the Butler type, or like Mr. Haldane, are romantically destructive. The romance of destruction is as natural to them, and they can resist it as little, as can a child. And it is both possible and useful to associate this romance of destruction of the man of science with the romance of destruction illustrated by the nihilist, by Herzen or Bakunin. This romance can become a rage. Both with the man of science, drunken with the notion of the power he is handling, of the vastness of the forces he is tapping, of the smallness of the individual human destiny, of the puniness of the human will, briefness of life, meanness of human knowledge, etc., and with the nihilist, from delight in frightening other children, the warm egotistic glow, this romance of destruction can easily pass over into sadism and homicide. With what Dostoevsky described as the possessed, with people at all events obsessed by some such thing as this romance of destruction, as I have called it, the step from a beneficent activity to a malevolent one is imperceptible. All love, in that connection, could be said to turn into hate. The love of the fanatic, like the brotherly love of the primitive Christian, always takes the form of destruction. Je t'aimais trop, voilà pourquoi. Je t'ai dit, sirs de cette vie. The Christian notion of the destruction of the world, otherworldliness altogether, was an expression of the fanatical love-hate, romance of destruction, of the religious variety. Scientific thought, or rather the feeling produced in men of science by scientific thought, is full of such material as that. Mr. Haldane ends his little book, Daedalus, on a note of that sort. He says, "The scientific worker of the future will more and more resemble the only figure of Daedalus as he becomes conscious of his ghastly mission and proud of it. Black is his robe from top to toe. All through his silent veins flow free hunger and thirst and venery." The verse ends in a description of the diabolical figure riding along singing a song of deicides. So Mr. Haldane's ideal man of science is a god-killer like Kant and Heine's romantic picture, that in which the author of the critique is compared to Robespierre, only more formidable than the latter, because the philosopher's natural prey is a god instead of a mere king. Mr. Haldane's scientist is riding along on an apocalyptic charger, suspect, trampling with the plunging movement of a ship, in the waves of a thick blood-red cloud. It is very likely, indeed, that the three horsemen of the apocalypse suggested this pretty emotional ending to Mr. Haldane. For it is a matter of common knowledge that most biologists and physicists spend their spare time in the cinema, especially favoring the apocalyptic or sensationally historical type of film. After inventing a new poison gas, for instance, Professor X will drop into the nearest superhouse if a good war film is being shown there at the moment, to get people into the mood for the next war, and to the intoxicating thumping and throbbing of the large orchestra will, in fancy, launch his latest discovery on a choking mass of the less scientific of his kind. I will quote from another man of science, certainly with more justification in useful works than Mr. Haldane, from an essay appearing in another series produced by Messrs. Kegan Paul. But, let the consequences of such a belief be as dire as they may, one thing is certain, that the state of the facts, whatever it may be, will surely get found out, and no human prudence can long arrest the triumphal car of truth, no, not if the discovery were such as to drive every individual of our race to suicide. Chance and Logic. C. S. Peirce. I should not dwell at such length on this subject if it were not of such obvious importance to us, who are not men of science, to understand the personal and private dispositions of those who are. Science is often referred to as the religion of the present day, just as socialism is. Like the socialist, the man of science is apt to be of a religious and fanatical temper. He may even be a socialist as well. This involves a lack of human feeling as a principle. No Scotch pastor, Genevan mystic, parson from the world of the way of all flesh, not St. Augustine himself, could be more callous, intolerant, militant, and resolved to make existence a very bitter struggle indeed for the survival of the holiest, fittest, humblest, strongest, and best in the imperium of a bitter and jealous God, than the average man of science for whom Mr. Haldane is the spokesman. We are told that there can be no truce between science and religion, that we must learn not to take traditional morals too seriously. What painful verbiage that must sound to anyone not a sectary of science or its enemy religion. For, whoever we are likely to be, shall we be able to dispense so gaily with traditional morals? The large lay audience of such a book as Daedalus is left with nothing more useful than the conviction that it will shortly be finished off in a most ingenious manner, and so all its trouble brought to a timely conclusion. You cannot insist enough, it seems to me, on the human factor in the man of science. Scientific discovery or the teaching of science is one thing, and the man of science as private man, reflecting on his functions and applying his discoveries or selling them to other people, is another, the layman wants often reminding of this to counteract his romantic tendencies. An engineer may build a remarkably fine bridge to enable people to cross a wide and powerful river, but if he sits down to write a little book about his engineer's function, it may become apparent, after you have read a few pages, that he is really explaining to people what an excellent jumping off board his bridge is for those tired of life and desiring to get right into the middle of the river without trouble. The romance of destruction could be regarded as a sort of vertigo that haunts the minds of those handling the forces of nature, in touch, at least, with almost magical powers.